Blood stained Elijah Harper's handkerchief as another cough tore through his chest. He quickly tucked it away before his twin sons entered the living room. At 58, the retired black soldier knew his time was running short, but the boys' future came first. David and Daniel, 17 and bursting with potential, deserved their shot at the prestigious military academy they couldn't stop talking about. That night, after they went to bed, Elijah's gaze lingered on his medals: Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. Each one earned through pain and sacrifice in battles fought long ago. By morning, his decision was made. The pawn shop owner's eyes widened as Elijah placed the velvet box on the counter. "These real?" he asked, lifting the Silver Star reverently. "As real as the scars that came with them," Elijah replied. The money would cover the academy fees with just enough left over for emergencies. What the twins didn't know was that their father's greatest act of heroism wasn't on any battlefield. It was happening right here, in a small-town pawn shop, as he traded his decorated past to secure their future. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The medals hung on the wall, each one gleaming against the faded paint of Elijah Harper's living room. They weren't just decorations. They were chapters of his life, written in bronze, silver, and ribbon. The Silver Star caught the last rays of sunset streaming through the cracked window, sending fractured light across the worn hardwood floor. Elijah ran a calloused hand over his short gray hair, settling deeper into his threadbare armchair. At 58, his body carried the weight of battles fought long ago, both overseas and at home. Outside, the small town of Millfield continued its quiet evening rhythm, oblivious to the war being waged in the old soldier's mind. "Dad, we're home," twin voices called from the front door, followed by the sound of duffel bags hitting the floor. Elijah straightened, his weathered face transforming. No matter how tired he felt, his sons always brought light back into the room. "In here, boys." David and Daniel Harper, 17 and identical down to the last freckle, appeared in the doorway. Though physically the same with their tall frames and warm brown skin, anyone who knew them could spot the differences immediately. David's posture was military straight, his movements calculated and efficient. Daniel bounced on his heels, eyes darting around the room, always looking for something new. "Coach Williams said I broke the school record for the obstacle course," Daniel announced, dropping onto the couch. "Beat it by 12 seconds. David leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "He also said you almost broke your neck showing off. On the wall climb." "Details," Daniel waved dismissively. "Dad, you should have seen the recruiter today. Lieutenant Wilson. Man had so many medals he looked like a Christmas tree." Elijah chuckled. "That right? He talked about the Anderson Military Academy," David added, his voice measured but unable to hide his excitement. "Said we both have what it takes." Elijah's smile remained fixed, but something tightened in his chest. Anderson was prestigious and expensive. "That's the one up in Virginia?" "Yeah," the twins answered simultaneously. "They've got the best officer training program in the country," David continued. "And if we graduate top of class, we're practically guaranteed spots at West Point." Daniel jumped in. "And Lieutenant Wilson said there's this prep program this summer that would give us an edge for admission. Only thing is," he exchanged glances with his brother. "The application fee and the summer program," David finished. It's pretty steep." Elijah nodded slowly, already doing mental calculations. His VA benefits barely covered the bills and groceries. The roof needed fixing before next winter. His truck was running on prayers and duct tape. "We'll figure it out," he said finally. "Your futures come first." Later that night, after the boys had gone to bed, Elijah pulled an old VHS tape from the back of his closet. He slid it into the ancient player, watching as grainy footage flickered to life on the small TV. Younger men in desert camo laughed and joked, unaware of what awaited them. A younger Elijah appeared on screen, arm around another soldier. "Here's Harper, our resident hero," a voice narrated from behind the camera. "Just saved Peterson's ass and won't shut up about it." The younger Elijah grinned and gave the camera the finger. "Someone's got to keep you ladies alive out here." Current Elijah watched silently, his fingers unconsciously tracing the outline of the silver star on the wall. That mission had cost them, Peterson anyway, along with 3 others. The medal came later, along with the nightmares. A coughing fit seized him suddenly, doubling him over. When he pulled his hand away from his mouth, spots of blood stained his palm. He wiped it quickly on his pants, a familiar ritual. The VA clinic doctor had been clear last month. The untreated bronchitis was getting worse, possibly developing into something more serious. Tests were needed. Elijah had nodded, taken the referral paper, and promptly stuffed it into his glove compartment. The boys came first. Always had. "Mr. Harper, I'm sorry, but with your current income and credit history." The bank employee, a young woman with sympathetic eyes, slid the loan application back across the desk. Her gaze flickered to the folder where his military discharge papers were visible. "Thank you for your service, sir, but this is business." Elijah nodded stiffly, gathering his papers. He'd expected this. 3 banks in 2 days had given him the same answer. Outside, he sat in his truck, staring at the application forms for Anderson Military Academy. The summer prep program was $4,500 per student. The application and testing fees another $500 each. Then there would be uniforms, travel expenses, books. His eyes drifted to the glove compartment, where the VA clinic referral lay ignored. Another cough rattled through him, leaving a metallic taste in his mouth. That evening, he watched his sons at the dinner table, heads bent over brochures from the academy. They were good boys, strong, smart, and more importantly, they had each other. Whatever they faced in life, they wouldn't face it alone. "Dad, you okay?" David asked, his observant eyes catching something in Elijah's expression. "Just proud," Elijah answered, forcing a smile. "You boys are going places I never could." The next morning, after the twins left for school, Elijah carefully removed each medal from the wall. The Silver Star, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the Army Commendation medals, each one placed gently in a velvet-lined box. His fingers lingered over the Silver Star. The citation came back to him. For gallantry in action against an opposing armed force. They didn't mention in the citation how scared he'd been, how his hands had shaken as he dragged Peterson to cover, bullets kicking up dirt around them, how Peterson had died anyway, whispering his wife's name. Elijah closed the box with a decisive click. Johnson's pawn shop was quiet that Thursday morning. Old man Johnson himself was behind the counter, eyebrows rising as Elijah placed the box before him. "These real?" Johnson asked, lifting the Silver Star with unexpected reverence. "As real as the scars that came with them," Elijah replied. Johnson's eyes met his. "Military man myself, Navy. Never got anything like these, though." He examined each medal carefully. "You sure about this, Harper?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "How much?" Johnson named a figure that was fair, more than fair, but still less than what Elijah needed for both boys. After some negotiation and the addition of his grandfather's watch, they settled on a number that would cover the academy costs with a small margin for emergencies. "I'll keep them safe," Johnson promised as Elijah turned to leave. "If you ever want to buy them back." Elijah nodded without turning around. They both knew he wouldn't be back. That night, he told the twins a carefully constructed story about a military foundation that supported veterans' children. Their faces lit up with excitement and relief. "See? I told you it would work out," Daniel exclaimed, punching his brother's arm. "When can we apply for the prep program?" David asked, always focused on the next steps. "Already sent the checks," Elijah answered. "You boys just focus on being ready." The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparations and excitement. Elijah helped them study for the entrance exams, staying up late despite the increasing frequency of his coughing fits. He drove them to physical training sessions, beaming with pride as they outperformed recruits years older. On the morning of their departure, the bus station was crowded with other families saying goodbye to young men and women in crisp uniforms. The prep program would last 8 weeks, followed immediately by the academic year if they were accepted. "You've got everything?" Elijah asked for the third time, straightening David's collar. "Yes, sir," David answered, standing at attention, though his voice wavered slightly. Daniel, less composed, wrapped his arms around Elijah in a tight hug. "We're gonna make you proud, Dad." "You already have," Elijah said, his voice rough. "Now listen, you two stick together but don't hold each other back. David, stop overthinking everything. Daniel, start thinking before you act. And both of you, remember, being a soldier isn't about the medals, it's about the people standing next to you." "Yes, sir," they answered in unison, shoulders squared. As the bus pulled away, Elijah stood at attention and raised his hand in a perfect salute. He held it until the bus disappeared around the corner, carrying his heart with it. The house was eerily quiet that night. Elijah sat in his armchair, staring at the empty spaces on the wall where his medals had hung. The outline of each was still visible on the faded paint, ghosts of honor traded for something more valuable. "Fly higher than I ever could," he whispered to the empty room, before another coughing fit bent him double, this one worse than before. 5 years passed like water through cupped hands, impossible to hold, impossible to recover. Captain David Harper stood at attention in the sweltering Afghan heat, his face an impassive mask, as the colonel pinned another commendation to his chest. At 22, he was one of the youngest Special Forces team leaders in the regiment, respected for his tactical precision and unwavering discipline. "The captain's actions saved the entire operation," the colonel announced to the assembled soldiers. "Leadership like this exemplifies the very best of our armed forces." David's eyes remained fixed forward, but his thoughts drifted to the last time he'd spoken to his twin. 6 months of silence now, the longest they'd ever gone. 4,000 miles away, Lieutenant Daniel Harper sat in a dimly lit intelligence center, eyes scanning multiple screens of satellite imagery and intercepted communications. His fingers flew across the keyboard, isolating patterns that others missed. Army intelligence had recruited him directly after his exceptional performance at Anderson and accelerated training. "Harper," his commanding officer called. "Briefing in 10. We've got movement in Sector 7. Daniel nodded, but his attention had caught on something else, a file reference that matched a pattern he'd been tracking. Something about a contractor, named Armitage Solutions, and a village that shouldn't exist according to official records. The twins had taken different paths after the academy. David embraced the chain of command, finding security in its structure. Daniel questioned everything, his analytical mind constantly probing for inconsistencies, for truths behind the official narrative. Their division had been growing for years, but the breaking point came during a rare joint mission 8 months ago. "Hold your position, Lieutenant," David's voice crackled through the radio, tight with controlled tension. Daniel, crouched behind a crumbling wall, watched as civilians scattered from the targeted building. Women, children. "Negative, Captain. We've got non-combatants in them. Kill zone! That's not our call to make. Command has confirmed hostiles only." Daniel's grip tightened on his rifle. Through his scope, he could clearly see a young girl, no more than 7, frozen in terror as her mother pulled her toward shelter. "Command is wrong," he replied flatly, and switched off his radio. What followed was a direct violation of orders. Daniel broke cover, moved into the exposed area, and helped evacuate the civilians, just moments before the airstrike hit. When the dust settled, they found evidence that the intelligence had indeed been flawed. The building had contained families, not fighters. Daniel escaped a dishonorable discharge by the narrowest margin, his actions ultimately saving lives, but the official report called it a dangerous breach of protocol that endangered the mission. David, who had maintained his position as ordered, hadn't spoken in his brother's defense at the inquiry. "You abandoned your post," David had said afterward, fury and disappointment warring in his eyes. "You abandoned the mission. You abandoned me." Daniel's response had been equally cutting. "I saved innocent lives while you hid behind orders. Dad would have done the same thing." The mention of their father had driven the final wedge between them. Back in Millfield, Elijah Harper sat on his front porch, showing 14-year-old Jalen Williams how to sand down a wooden eagle. "Steady strokes, son," he instructed, his voice raspier than it had been 5 years ago. Let the grain tell you which way to move. Jalen nodded earnestly, his young face set in concentration. The boy had started coming around 3 years ago after his father, a Marine, died in a training accident. Elijah recognized the lost look in his eyes, the same one he'd seen in the mirror after coming home from war. Mr. Harper? Jalen asked, not looking up from his work. Did you really get a silver star? Elijah's hand stilled momentarily. Who told you that? My mom said you were a hero, said you saved a bunch of guys in your unit. Elijah resumed his work, carefully shaping the eagle's wing. The real heroes don't come home, Jalen. Remember that. Later that afternoon, as Jalen rode his bike home, Elijah collapsed while bringing in firewood. The neighbor, Mrs. Tanner, found him and called an ambulance despite his protests. At the hospital, the diagnosis was both expected and devastating. Early-stage lung cancer, likely, exacerbated by exposure to burn pits during his service. With treatment, your prognosis could be quite good, the doctor explained, flipping through his chart. Though I'm concerned about how long you've been ignoring symptoms. Elijah nodded absently, thinking not of his health but of his son's. The last letter he'd sent them had been returned unopened. They were focused on their careers, on proving themselves. His illness would only be a distraction. I'll think about it, he told the doctor, with no intention of doing so. Daniel stood at rigid attention as the general pinned the Meritorious Service Medal to his chest. The ceremony was small, subdued, unlike the public recognition David had received for his combat decoration. Your intelligence work saved American lives, Lieutenant, the general said, though the specifics must remain classified. Daniel nodded, accepting the honor while feeling strangely hollow. The medal should have meant something. Would have, if his father or brother had been there to see it. That night he stared at the blank email he'd started to his father a dozen times. News of his achievement felt empty without someone to share it with. Daniel closed the laptop without sending anything. Meanwhile, David stood on a stage at the Pentagon, receiving the Distinguished Service Cross from the Joint Chiefs themselves. Cameras flashed as he saluted sharply, the epitome of military bearing. Captain Harper represents the future of our armed forces, the general announced. His leadership under fire exemplifies the warrior ethos. As the ceremony concluded, David found himself searching the crowd, half expecting to see his father's proud face or his brother's familiar smile. The absence left an unexpected ache. Neither twin knew that across the country, Elijah sat alone in his small house, recording separate video messages for each of them. His frame was thinner now, his once powerful shoulders slightly hunched. David, he said to the camera, his voice steady despite the effort it cost him. You always were the careful one. Even as a baby, you'd watch and plan before you'd take your first step. He paused, fighting back a cough. I'm proud of the man you've become, the leader. But remember, there's a difference between following orders and following your conscience. Sometimes they lead to different places. Later, he recorded a separate message for Daniel. Danny, he began, using the childhood nickname his son had outgrown. You came into this world raising hell, and I suspect you'll leave it the same way. A smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. Your heart always leads you, son. That's your strength. But it can be your weakness too. Learn to balance that fire with your brother's ice. You're stronger together than apart. He hesitated, considering whether to tell them about the medals, about the pawn shop, about his illness. In the end, he decided against it. Some truths were burdens they didn't need to carry. Instead, he told them a story he'd never shared, about his Silver Star mission, about disobeying a direct order to retreat when he saw the opportunity to save his trapped unit, about how the Army had quietly covered up his insubordination because the mission had ultimately succeeded, about how he'd accepted a quiet discharge rather than risk exposing his commanding officer, who had a family depending on his pension. So you see, boys, he concluded, his voice growing hoarse, sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do isn't charging into battle. Sometimes it's walking away from the recognition you deserve to protect something more important. The red light. On the camera blinked as the recording ended. Elijah slumped back in his chair, exhausted by the effort. On the table beside him lay his medication, largely untaken. The cancer was advancing faster than expected. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering Millfield in a blanket of pristine white. Elijah watched through the window, remembering how the twins used to build elaborate snow forts, working in perfect tandem without needing to speak. David designing the structure, Daniel bringing it to life with creative flourishes. "You boys were always stronger together," he whispered to the empty room. In their separate corners of the world, David and Daniel Harper both stood at attention, wearing identical medals on different uniforms, neither aware that the greatest honor their father had earned now sat in a pawnshop drawer, sacrificed for their future. The government-issued laptop hummed softly in Daniel's apartment. 3 in the morning, and sleep was nowhere in sight. Daniel rubbed his eyes, the blue light from the screen the only illumination in the room. What had started as routine intelligence analysis had led him down a rabbit hole he couldn't ignore. Project Ember, he whispered to himself, staring at the encrypted file that had taken him weeks to access. The name had appeared repeatedly in connection with Armitage Solutions, a defense contractor with ties to several classified operations. Daniel's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Digging deeper could end his career, or worse. But something about the operation's timeline nagged at him. The dates aligned with his father's final deployment, the one he never talked about. With a deep breath, he initiated the decryption sequence he'd designed. The screen flashed, code scrolling rapidly as the security protocols fell away. Finally, a folder appeared, containing dozens of files with heavily redacted mission reports. "Holy shit," Daniel breathed as he scanned the first document. Photos of a village in ruins. Coordinates in North Africa. A list of operatives including Harper E., his father's name, right there among the team members. Dawn was breaking when Daniel finally stepped away from the computer. The pieces didn't fit together yet, but one thing was clear. Project Ember wasn't just controversial. Based on the evidence, it had violated international law, and someone had gone to great lengths to bury it. He needed to talk to someone who understood the implications, someone who could access Pentagon records without raising alarms. He needed his brother. David's apartment in Arlington was pristine, everything in its place, a stark contrast to his brother's chaotic living space. The phone vibrated on his nightstand, displaying Daniel's number. David stared at it, conflicted. 6 months of silence and now a call at 7 in the morning? Against his better judgment, he answered. "This is Captain Harper." "David, it's me. I need to talk to you about something. It's about Dad." David's posture stiffened automatically. "Is he okay?" "He's fine. I assume he is. This isn't about his health, it's about his service. Project Ember. Does that name mean anything to you?" A long pause filled the line. "David? This isn't a secure line, Daniel. And whatever you think you've found..." "I've found the truth," Daniel cut in, his voice tight with frustration. "Or part of it. Dad's unit was involved in something big, something they covered up. Armitage Solutions is connected to it, and now they're getting billion-dollar contracts from DoD. "Leave it alone," David said, his voice hardening. "You're chasing classified ghosts. It'll cost you everything you've worked for." "Like you'd care," Daniel snapped. "You made it pretty clear where your loyalty lies, and it's not with family." The line went dead before David could respond. He sat motionless on the edge of his bed, uniform half assembled for the day ahead. His brother was digging into something dangerous. That much was clear. But was it because he cared about their father, or was this just another example of Daniel's inability to respect boundaries and authority? With deliberate movements, David finished dressing, his mind working through the implications. Project Ember. He'd need to be careful how he looked into this. Very careful. Elijah's house looked smaller somehow, Daniel thought as he pulled into the driveway. The paint was peeling in places, and the porch steps sagged slightly. How long had it been since his last visit? 2 years? He felt a pang of guilt as he knocked on the door. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Finally, shuffling footsteps approached, and the door swung open to reveal his father. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Elijah had always been strong, solid as an oak. The man before him now was thinner, his shoulders slightly stooped, his breathing labored. Daniel. Surprise and joy bloomed across Elijah's weathered face. My God, son, this is unexpected. They embraced awkwardly, both men suddenly unsure how to bridge the distance that had grown between them. Come in, Elijah gestured, leading him into the familiar living room. What brings you home? You on leave? Something like that, Daniel replied, his eyes drawn to the empty spots on the wall where his father's medals had once hung. Dad, where are your medals? A shadow passed over Elijah's face. Had them cleaned. They're put away for safekeeping. The lie came easily. Practiced. You want some coffee? Just made a fresh pot. Daniel accepted the steaming mug, using the moment to study his father more carefully. The slight wheeze in his breathing, the way he favored his left side, the pill bottles visible on the kitchen counter. You're sick, Daniel stated flatly. Elijah waved dismissively. Just getting old, son. Nothing to worry about. Dad, I said it's nothing. Elijah cut him off, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. Now what's really bringing you home after all this time? Must be important. Daniel hesitated, then pulled out a folder containing printouts from the files he'd discovered. Project Ember. You were there, weren't you? In North Africa. Elijah's cup froze halfway to his lips. His eyes, suddenly sharp and alert, locked onto Daniel's. Where did you get this? It doesn't matter. What matters is what happened there. The reports are heavily redacted, but I can read between the lines. Something went wrong, didn't it? Something bad enough that they're still covering it up 30 years later. Elijah carefully set down his cup and leaned forward, his voice dropping. Some truths protect lives, Daniel. Some stones are better left unturned. That's not good enough, Daniel pressed. I'm connected to this through you. I need to know what happened. No, you don't, Elijah said firmly. What you need to do is drop this, now. A coughing fit seized him, and he struggled to catch his breath. Daniel moved to help him, but Elijah waved him away, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket. When he finally caught his breath, his voice was ragged. Promise me you'll let this go. Looking into his father's eyes, Daniel found he couldn't make that promise. Instead, he changed the subject, turning the conversation to lighter memories. Fishing, trips and school games from years past. But his mind remained fixed on the mystery, now deepened by his father's reaction. As Daniel drove away that evening, he didn't notice the 14-year-old boy watching from the neighbor's yard, or the way the boy slipped into Elijah's house. After his departure, Mr. Harper? Jalen called, closing the door behind him. It's me. He found Elijah in the kitchen, staring out the window, lost in thought. Jalen, he acknowledged with a tired smile. You just missed my son Daniel. I saw him, Jalen confirmed, setting his backpack on the counter. He looks like you. In the photo, I mean. Elijah raised an eyebrow. What photo? Jalen hesitated, then unzipped his backpack and carefully removed a small frame. Inside was a newspaper clipping showing a younger Elijah in uniform receiving his silver star. Where did you get that? Elijah asked softly. Library archives, Jalen said proudly. Did a school project on local veterans. He paused. Also, I found something else. His hand disappeared into the backpack again and emerged holding a medal, the bronze star that Elijah had pawned years earlier. Elijah stared at it, momentarily speechless. Saw it at Johnson's pawn shop when I was looking for a birthday gift for my mom, Jalen explained. Mr. Johnson said it belonged to you. I saved up my allowance. He shrugged, suddenly shy. Thought you should have it back. Elijah took the medal with trembling fingers, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Jalen, I can't accept this. You earned it, the boy said simply. Elijah looked from the medal to the earnest young face before him, wondering what he'd done to deserve such loyalty. Thank you, he said, his voice rough. This means more than you know. After Jalen left, Elijah sat alone in his living room, turning the bronze star over in his hands. One medal returned from 5. A small redemption, but meaningful nonetheless. His thoughts turned to Daniel's visit, to the questions about Project Ember. Dangerous questions. With a heavy sigh, Elijah retrieved a dusty box from the top shelf of his closet. Inside were letters, photos, and a small notebook, his private record of what had really happened in North Africa. Things he'd never told anyone, not even his sons. Especially not his sons. If Daniel kept digging, he'd be in danger. Real danger. Elijah needed to decide whether to finally reveal the truth or take it to his grave as he'd planned. In Washington, David stood in his dress uniform before the President of the United States, rigid with pride as a medal was pinned to his chest, coincidentally the same honor his father had once received. The Oval Office was filled with brass and politicians, all there to witness the ceremony honoring his leadership during a classified operation. Captain Harper represents the finest traditions of service and sacrifice, the President declared, hands clasped over David's shoulders for the cameras. Afterward, at the reception, a senior DoD official drew David aside, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Impressive work, Captain. Your father would be proud." "Thank you, sir." "Strange coincidence," the official continued, swirling his drink. "I just heard your brother's been making inquiries about old operations, Project Ember specifically." The smile remained fixed, but his voice cooled. "That's ancient history and classified. Might want to advise him to be more discreet." David's face revealed nothing, but alarm bells rang in his mind. This wasn't a casual observation. It was a warning. Daniel had touched a nerve, and someone powerful had noticed. "I'll speak with him, sir." Later that night, as David drove home, his phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. When he checked it at a stoplight, his blood ran cold. Protect your father's legacy, or bury it. Threat was clear, but the choice wasn't. For the first time in his career, David found himself questioning where his true duty lay. Daniel's apartment door was ajar when he returned from a run. He drew his sidearm immediately, years of training kicking in. Moving silently through his own home, he found nothing obviously disturbed, until he reached his office. The computer was untouched, but taped to the monitor was a single photograph, his father's unit in North Africa, their faces clearly visible. Written across it in red marker were the words, "Some secrets stay buried with their keepers." Daniel's hands shook slightly as he removed the photo. Someone had been in his home. Someone knew what he was investigating, and they had access to classified photos he hadn't even seen yet. His phone rang, startling him. The caller ID showed a name he didn't recognize. Ava Carter. "Lieutenant Harper," a woman's voice said when he answered. "We need to talk about Elijah. Harper and Project Ember, not on the phone. Tomorrow, National Mall, Lincoln Memorial, 1400 hours, come alone." The line went dead. Daniel stared at the phone, mind racing. Ava Carter. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. With renewed determination, he returned to his computer, initiating another search, this time for any connection between his father and this mysterious woman. By morning, he had his answer. Ava Carter, now a deputy director at the Department of Defense, had served in his father's unit 30 years ago. She'd been there in North Africa during Project Ember. The pieces were finally coming together. All he needed now was her testimony. The Lincoln Memorial was crowded with tourists, providing perfect cover for their meeting. Daniel spotted her immediately, a tall woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair, sitting alone on a bench, feeding pigeons. "Deputy Director Carter," he said, sitting beside her without making eye contact. "Lieutenant," she acknowledged, continuing to toss breadcrumbs. "I wasn't sure you'd come. You called me about my father, about Project Ember. Why?" Ava sighed, her eyes scanning the crowd. "Because you're asking questions, and that's making powerful people nervous. People who can make problems disappear, including people." Daniel tensed. "Are you threatening me?" Warning you, she corrected. Elijah was my friend, my mentor. He saved my life in more ways than one. She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. What do you know about Project Ember? Not enough, Daniel admitted. I know it was a Black Ops mission in North Africa. I know Armitage Solutions was involved. I know my father was there, and something went wrong. Something they've been covering, up for 3 decades. Ava nodded slowly. Project Ember was supposed to be a simple extraction, a scientist working on biological weapons wanting to defect. Instead, we found a village of test subjects, civilians being used as guinea pigs. Orders came down to eliminate all evidence, including witnesses. Daniel's breath caught. You mean, they ordered us to kill everyone? Women, children. Leave, no trace. Her voice hardened. Your father refused. He organized an evacuation instead. Got those people out against direct orders. And the army covered it up? Armitage did, she corrected. They had too much to lose if the truth came out. So they buried it, made it look like the mission was a success, that the village had been empty. Your father. She hesitated. Elijah took the fall for a mistake I made, a tactical error that cost lives. He accepted a quiet discharge to protect me, to protect all of us who followed his lead instead of our orders. Daniel absorbed this, pieces falling into place. And now Armitage is one of the largest defense contractors in the world. With government connections at the highest levels, Ava confirmed, including senators who were officers back then. People who don't want their past decisions examined. I need proof, Daniel said. Documents, testimony, anything concrete. Ava smiled sadly. I've been gathering evidence for years, waiting for the right moment. She passed him a small flash drive. This contains everything I have, use it wisely. As they parted ways, neither noticed the man watching them through a telephoto lens from across the reflecting pool. 3 days later, Daniel turned on the news to see Ava Carter's face on the screen. The headline froze his blood. Doda official, missing, car found abandoned. He tried calling her secure line, then her personal number. Nothing. The flash drive she'd given him contained encrypted files he was still working to access. Without her to explain the contents, he was flying blind. His phone rang, David's number. Despite everything, relief flooded through him. Daniel, where are you? David's voice was tense, urgent. My apartment. Why? Stay there. Don't leave. I'm coming to you. The line went dead. An hour later, David arrived in civilian clothes, his face grim. Without a word, he swept Daniel's apartment for surveillance devices, checking places only someone with specialized training would know to look. What the hell is going on? Daniel demanded once David had finished. You've stepped into something. Bigger than you realize, David said, keeping his voice low. I've been using my Pentagon access to trace internal memos about Project Ember. It goes all the way to the top, Daniel. Cabinet level. Ava Carter is missing, Daniel said. She gave me information about Dad, about what really happened. David's expression tightened. What did she tell you? Daniel hesitated, still uncertain how much to trust his brother. Dad disobeyed orders to save civilians. He took the fall for someone else's mistake, Ava's. The whole mission was covered up. David nodded, unsurprised. I found evidence of falsified reports, doctored satellite imagery. They built an entire fictional version of events. He ran a hand through his short hair, a rare gesture of agitation. I've been approached, Daniel, warned. They're watching you, us. Who's they? Black Ops, contractors. I don't know exactly, but they have reach inside the military. They gave me a choice, stop you or be discharged. The brothers stared at each other, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Years of distance and hurt still hung between them, but beneath it all was the unbreakable bond they'd shared since birth. Why are you here then? Daniel asked finally. Why warn me instead of stopping me? David's jaw tightened. Because you're my brother, and because... He hesitated. Because I think you're right. Miles away, in a modest house in Millfield, Elijah, Harper sat on his back porch with Jalen, their current woodworking project between them. An intricately carved bald eagle, nearly complete. "Mr. Harper," Jalen ventured cautiously, "can I ask you something?" "Shoot," Elijah replied, focused on sanding the eagle's wing to a perfect smoothness. "Why don't you ever talk about how you got your medals? My dad used to tell stories about his service all the time." Elijah's hands stilled. After a long pause, he sighed. "Because the story they tell isn't always the whole truth, Jalen. And sometimes the whole truth doesn't fit on a citation." "I don't understand." Elijah sat down, his tools, and looked the boy in the eye. "The truest things I ever did in the service never earned me any medals, and some of the medals I received." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Let's just say the real heroes don't always get recognized, and not everyone wearing a medal earned it the way you'd think." Jalen considered this, turning the eagle in his hands. "Is that why you don't have them displayed anymore? Because they remind you of bad things?" Elijah smiled faintly. "Something like that." A coughing fit seized him, suddenly, worse than before. When it finally subsided, he found Jalen staring at him in alarm. "You should see a doctor," the boy said firmly. "I have," Elijah admitted, too exhausted to maintain the pretense. "Not much they can do now except make me comfortable." Jalen's eyes widened. "You're dying?" "We're all dying, son. I'm just doing it on a faster schedule than I'd hoped." Elijah squeezed the boy's shoulder. "Don't look so scared. I've made my peace with it." "Does David know? Does Daniel?" Elijah shook his head. "They've got their own battles to fight. Don't need to be worrying about their old man." Later, after Jalen had gone home, Elijah sat alone with the nearly completed eagle carving. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone and recorded another message for his sons, this one more urgent, more honest than before. "Boys," he began, his voice raspier than ever, "there's something you need to know about Project Ember, about what really happened there." He paused, gathering his strength. "I've kept secrets to protect people, but now I think the truth might protect you more." He spoke for nearly an hour, laying bare everything he knew about the mission, the cover-up, and the people behind it. When he finished, exhaustion overwhelmed him, and he slipped into a fitful sleep right there on the porch, the phone still clutched in his hand. Jalen, who had forgotten his backpack and returned to retrieve it, found him there. Carefully, he took the phone and placed it on the table, then covered Elijah with a blanket from the living room. Before leaving, he noticed the video recording app still open on the phone. Hesitating only briefly, he pressed play and listened to Elijah's confession. By the time the recording ended, Jalen's face was set with determination. He knew what he had to do. In Daniel's apartment, the brothers had reached an uneasy alliance. "I need access to the secured government database," Daniel explained, showing David the encrypted files from Ava. "Without the decryption keys, this is useless." David paced the small living room. "That's impossible. Those systems are air-gapped, protected by biometric security. Even with my clearance, I can get in," Daniel interrupted. "I've been developing a backdoor for months, but I need physical access and a distraction." David stared at his brother. "That's treason, Daniel." "Is it? Or is covering up war crimes the real treason?" Daniel challenged. "These files could prove what happened, vindicate Dad, expose Armitage, maybe even help us find Ava before something worse happens to her." A tense silence fell between them. "If we do this," David said finally, "we do it my way. Controlled, precise. No room for your usual improvisation." Daniel suppressed a smile. "Yes, sir, Captain." The next 48 hours were a blur of preparation. Using David's security clearance and Daniel's hacking expertise, they formulated a plan to access the classified databases where the full Project Ember files were stored. The morning they were set to execute their plan, David received a text from an unknown number. "Back down now or join your brother in disgrace. Final warning." He deleted it without showing Daniel. Some burdens didn't need to be shared. The hack itself was anticlimactic. David's credentials got them into the facility, and Daniel's software did the rest. piercing through layers of security to extract the complete Project Ember files. They were out in 20 minutes, leaving no trace of their intrusion. Back in the safety of Daniel's apartment, they pored over the documents. The truth was worse than they'd imagined. The village had been deliberately exposed to experimental biological agents. When the test went wrong, Armitage had ordered the elimination of all evidence, including the villagers. Elijah and a small group of soldiers had refused, instead evacuating survivors and documenting the atrocities. "He saved those people," David whispered, staring at a photograph of his father helping children onto a transport helicopter. "He defied direct orders to do the right thing. And they punished him for it," Daniel added. "Forced him into silence with threats against his career, his benefits. Against us," David realized suddenly. "Look at this memo. They threatened to deny his son's applications to any service academy if he spoke out." The brothers sat in stunned silence, absorbing the magnitude of their father's sacrifice. Not just his career, but his legacy, his reputation, all to protect them and the truth. Their contemplation was interrupted by Daniel's phone. The caller ID read, "Millfield General Hospital." "This is Daniel Harper," he answered, a knot forming in his stomach. "Mr. Harper, this is Nurse Winters from Millfield General. I'm calling about your father, Elijah Harper. He's been admitted in critical condition. The doctors are asking for family to come as soon as possible." Daniel's face drained of color as he relayed the message to David. Their father was dying, and they were hundreds of miles away with evidence that could either vindicate him or put them all in danger. "We need to go to him," David said immediately. "Everything else can wait." "What about the files? What about exposing the truth?" Daniel protested. "This might be our only chance." David gripped his brother's shoulder. "Dad earned his medals by following orders," he said quietly. "Then he earned his true honor by breaking one. For the right reason. What do you think he'd want us to do right now?" Daniel nodded slowly, understanding. They would go to their father. But first, he made one quick call to a military journalist he'd known from his intelligence days, someone he trusted implicitly. "I have a story you need to hear," he said, "and evidence to back it up, but I need to see my father first." As they gathered their things to leave, both brothers were unaware that in a small town hours away, a 14-year-old boy was already setting events in motion that would change everything. Uploading Elijah's confession to a private server and sending the access link to every media outlet in the country. The storm was about to break, with their father at its center. The antiseptic smell of the hospital hit David and Daniel as they rushed through the sliding doors of Millfield General. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across their faces as they approached the information desk. "We're here for Elijah Harper," David said, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "We're his sons." The nurse looked up, recognition flickering in her eyes. "Third floor ICU, room 307. They found Dr. Reynolds outside their father's room, reviewing charts. He was a tall man with kind eyes that had seen too much suffering. "Harper family?" he asked, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. Reynolds. I've been treating your father for the past several months." "Months?" Daniel echoed, exchanging a look with David. "How long has he been sick?" Dr. Reynolds hesitated. "Your father was diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer. Approximately 8 months ago. He initially responded well to treatment but recently stopped coming in for his appointments." He sighed. "The cancer has progressed to stage 4. It's metastasized to his liver and bones." David's face remained impassive, but his hands clenched at his sides. "What's his prognosis?" "Days, maybe weeks," Dr. Reynolds said gently. "I'm sorry." The twins stood in silence, absorbing the news. Their father had been dying for months, and they hadn't known, hadn't been there. "Can we see him?" Daniel asked, his voice rough. Dr. Reynolds nodded. "He's been drifting in and out of consciousness. Don't expect too much." Elijah looked small in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed. His once powerful frame had withered, his dark skin ashen. An oxygen mask covered most of his face, but his eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. "Dad," David said softly, approaching the bed with Daniel close behind. Elijah's eyes shifted toward them, widening slightly in recognition. With visible effort, he lifted a trembling hand to remove the oxygen mask. "My boys," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You came." Daniel took his father's hand, shocked by how light it felt, how fragile the bones seemed beneath the skin. "Why didn't you tell us you were sick?" A ghost of a smile crossed Elijah's lips. "You had your own battles." David moved to the other side of the bed, struggling to maintain his composure. "We know about Project Ember, Dad. We know what you did, what they made you do." Elijah's eyes closed briefly. When they opened again, they were clearer, more focused. "You shouldn't have dug into that. It's dangerous." "We had to know the truth," Daniel insisted. "You saved those people. You disobeyed orders because it was the right thing to do. And you took the fall for Ava Carter's mistake," David added. Elijah's gaze shifted between his sons. "How did you—" "Oh, we found the files," Daniel explained, "and Ava told me everything before she disappeared." A shadow passed over Elijah's face. "Ava's gone?" The twins exchanged looks. "She's missing," David confirmed. "After she met with Daniel." Elijah struggled to sit up, triggering a coughing fit that left specks of blood on the oxygen mask. The machines began beeping more urgently. "You boys are in danger," he managed when he could speak again. "If they silenced Ava," a nurse rushed in, alarmed by the monitors. "You need to leave," she told the twins firmly. "He needs rest." They retreated to the hallway, both shaken by their father's condition and his warning. "We need to talk," David said, leading his brother to a quiet corner of the waiting room. For the first time in years, the twins had a real conversation. Honest, raw, painful. They spoke of missed opportunities, of misunderstandings, of the rift that had grown between them. "I should have supported you at the hearing," David admitted, his voice low. "You were right to save those civilians, just like Dad was right in Project Ember." Daniel shook his head. "And I should have understood your position. Following the chain of command isn't just blindly obeying. It's about trust, about systems that keep people alive." He paused. "We were both right, in our ways, and both wrong to let it divide us." David nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright. "Dad sacrificed everything for us. His medals, his health, his reputation," Daniel added. "He let them paint him as the one who made the mistake, to protect Ava and the others who stood with him." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their father's sacrifice settling over them. "What are we going to do about the files?" David finally asked. "About the truth?" Before Daniel could answer, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check the news. It's already happening." Confused, Daniel pulled up a news site on his phone. His breath caught as he read the headline. "Decorated veteran took. Fall for military crime. Sons of hero fight to clear his name." "What the hell?" he murmured, showing the screen to David. The story was breaking across multiple networks. Project Ember exposed, complete with portions of Elijah's confession and supporting documents. But they hadn't released anything yet. How was this possible? Their answer came minutes later when Jalen slipped into the waiting room, his young face a mixture of defiance and concern. "Is Mr. Harper okay?" he asked. "Jalen?" David recognized the boy from photos their father had sent. "What are you doing here?" "I had to come," Jalen said simply. "I gave his story to the right person." He pulled out his phone, showing them the video of Elijah's confession. "He recorded this. I found him passed out with it still open on his phone. I sent it to some reporters." The twins stared at the boy in shock. "You leaked this?" Daniel asked, gesturing to the news on his phone. Jalen straightened his shoulders. "Mr. Harper deserves the truth to be told. He's a hero." Before either brother could respond, a nurse appeared in the doorway. "He's asking for you," she said. "All of you." They returned to find Elijah awake and more alert, having been stabilized. His eyes found Jalen immediately. "You shouldn't be here, son," he said weakly. "School night." Jalen approached the bed hesitantly. "I had to make sure you were okay, Mr. Harper." A ghost of a smile touched Elijah's lips. Stubborn, like my boys. His gaze shifted to his sons. The story's out, isn't it? I can see it in your faces. David nodded. Breaking across all networks. Jalen sent your confession to the press. Elijah's eyes widened slightly as he looked at the boy. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Good boy. Jalen's face lit up with relief. Dad, Daniel began carefully. With your story public, things are going to get complicated. The Pentagon, Armitage Solutions, they're going to deny everything. Let them, Elijah said, suddenly looking stronger than he had in months. Truth's like water. Pressed down in one place, it rises in another. As if on cue, Daniel's phone rang, the military journalist he'd contacted earlier. Daniel Harper, he answered, putting it on speaker. Lieutenant Harper, your father's story is exploding online, the journalist said without preamble. I've already received calls from 3 different Pentagon officials demanding we retract. But there's something you should know. Ava Carter just contacted me. She's alive in hiding, and she recorded her own testimony before she disappeared. The room fell silent as they absorbed this news. She says she has proof, documents, photos, even DNA samples from the victims, the journalist continued. And she's not the only one coming forward. 2 other members of your father's unit have reached out, willing to testify about what they witnessed. Elijah closed his eyes, tears tracking silently down his weathered cheeks. After all these years, he whispered. Outside the hospital, something remarkable was happening. Veterans who had seen the news began arriving, first in 1s and 2s, then by the dozens. They gathered in the parking lot, many in uniform, holding candles and American flags. Word had spread through veteran networks like wildfire. Elijah Harper, the soldier who had saved innocent lives against orders, who had sacrificed his career and reputation to protect others, was dying. By evening, social media was flooded with hashtags. Honor Elijah, Medals for Truth, Project Ember Truth. Veterans across the country began sharing their own stories of moral choices made in combat, of the complexity of duty versus conscience. In Washington, the story was causing tremors. Armitage Solutions issued a swift denial, calling the allegations false and defamatory. The Pentagon released a carefully worded statement claiming the matter was under review, but categorically denying any cover-up. Then Ava Carter's pre-recorded testimony leaked online, detailed, specific, and devastating, in its account of what had really happened in that African village. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Senator William Tate, now chairman of the Armed Services Committee, was ambushed by reporters outside his office. These allegations are absurd, he declared, his face flushed with anger. I had no knowledge of any such operation. But hours later, an old photograph surfaced. A young Lieutenant Colonel Tate standing with Elijah and other members of the unit, just days before the Project Ember mission. The senator's denials suddenly rang hollow. Back in Millfield General, Elijah rested, occasionally drifting into consciousness. During one such moment, he found both his sons sitting by his bed in their full dress uniforms. "What's this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thought you might like to see us together again," David said, adjusting the medals on his chest. Daniel leaned closer. "The world knows the truth now, Dad. They know what you did, what you sacrificed." A weak smile crossed Elijah's face. "Worth it for you boys." His breathing became more labored, his eyes struggling to stay open. "Always worth it." The monitors began beeping erratically. Elijah's body tensed, then went limp as his eyes rolled back. Medical staff rushed in, pushing the brothers aside as they worked frantically to stabilize him. In the hallway, David paced, while Daniel leaned against the wall, head in his hands. Jalen sat silently nearby, his young face pale with worry. "He can't die now," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "Not when we're so close to clearing his name." David stopped pacing, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. "We're not done, Pop," he whispered, as if Elijah could hear him through the walls. "We're not done." The crowd outside Millfield General had grown from dozens to hundreds overnight. Veterans from as far away as California had made the journey, standing shoulder to shoulder with local residents and active-duty military who had taken emergency leave. Signs and banners filled the parking lot. Justice for Elijah Harper. Honor. Before orders. Return his medals. News vans lined the street, reporters doing live updates with the growing crowd as their backdrop. Inside, Elijah had been stabilized but remained unconscious, his condition listed as critical. David and Daniel took turns sitting with him, neither willing to leave the hospital while their father fought for his life. On the third morning, as Daniel dozed in the uncomfortable chair by his father's bed, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. "Daniel Harper," he answered quietly, stepping into the hallway. "Lieutenant Harper, this is Margaret Winters, Department of Justice." The woman's voice was crisp, professional. "I'm calling to inform you that you've been summoned to appear before a federal grand jury regarding the unauthorized release of classified information pertaining to Operation Ember." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "You're charging me? For exposing war crimes?" "The hearing is scheduled for next Monday at 9 a.m. Your presence is required by law." She paused. "I should also inform you that the FBI has secured a warrant to search your residence and electronic devices." After she hung up, Daniel stood frozen in the hallway. He'd expected backlash, but not this fast, not this official. They were trying to make an example of him. When he told David, his brother's face darkened. "They're desperate," he said. "This is a warning shot, trying to silence anyone else who might come forward." "I need a lawyer," Daniel replied grimly. As if fate had been listening, a young woman approached them later that day in the hospital cafeteria. She was in her early 30s, with fierce eyes and a determined set to her jaw. "Lieutenant Harper? Captain Harper? I'm Sarah Nichols." She handed them each a business card. "I'm an attorney with the Military Justice Advocacy Project." Daniel glanced at her card. "How did you find us?" "My father served under Elijah Harper," she said simply. "Master Sergeant James Nichols. He died in that mission, the one your father tried to save people from." Her voice remained steady, but her eyes flashed. "I've been waiting years for this story to break. I want to represent you, Lieutenant Harper, in the federal case they're building." The brothers exchanged looks. "I don't have money for a high-profile defense," Daniel admitted. Sarah shook her head. "Pro bono. This case isn't just about you or your father anymore. It's about every soldier who's ever had to choose between orders and conscience." Outside the hospital, the movement continued to grow. Jalen, too young to fully understand the legal implications but old enough to recognize injustice, had become something of a spokesperson for the younger generation. A video of him speaking passionately outside the courthouse went viral overnight. "If Elijah Harper was a criminal," the 14-year-old declared, his voice cracking with emotion, "I don't want to be a good citizen. I want to be whatever he is, a person who does what's right no matter what it costs him." The video was shared millions of times, picked up by national news, turned into memes and rallying cries. Overnight, a teenager from a small town became the face of a movement demanding accountability and honesty from military leadership. Meanwhile, David faced his own crucible. Summoned to the Pentagon, he found himself in a conference room with 3 generals and the Secretary of Defense himself. "Captain Harper," the secretary began without preamble, "you've served with distinction. Your record is impeccable, which is why this situation is particularly disappointing." David stood at attention, saying nothing. "We're prepared to overlook your involvement in this misunderstanding," the secretary continued. "In fact, there's a promotion to major being processed for you right now. All we ask is that you distance yourself publicly from your brother's actions and allegations." The implication was clear. Betray Daniel or face the consequences. David took a deep breath. "With all due respect, Mr. Secretary, my father taught Me, that rank means nothing without honor. He removed his captain's bars and placed them on the table. If supporting my brother and the truth cost me my career, it's a price I'm willing to pay. The room fell silent. Then the oldest general, a man with silver hair and eyes that had seen too many wars, spoke quietly. You sound just like Elijah. David was escorted from the building, his security clearance revoked. But as he walked down the Pentagon steps, for the first time in years, he felt truly free. Back in Millfield, an unexpected ally emerged. Retired General Michael Lawrence arrived at the hospital unannounced, asking to see Elijah. The nurses, now fiercely protective of their patient, nearly turned him away until Daniel recognized the name. General Lawrence, you served with my father? Matui. Old soldier nodded, his bearing still military straight despite his 70 years. I was his commanding officer before Project Ember. May I see him? They allowed the general into Elijah's room. Lawrence stood at the foot of the bed looking at the unconscious man with undisguised emotion. I knew the truth, he admitted to the twins afterward. I've known for decades. I was transferred just before that mission, but I heard whispers. When Elijah was discharged, I suspected what had happened. He pulled a small leather journal from his jacket. I kept records, names, dates, conversations. I thought someday the truth would matter. Daniel took the journal with reverent hands. Why didn't you come forward before? The general's face showed his age suddenly. Fear, cowardice. Call it what you will. I had a family, a pension, a reputation. He straightened his shoulders. But I can't stay silent anymore. Not after seeing what your father has endured. What you boys are enduring now. That evening, something remarkable happened. Elijah opened his eyes. Fully conscious for the first time in days, he gazed at his sons with surprising clarity. My boys, he whispered, his voice weak but steady. Together again. They moved to his bedside immediately, David adjusting the oxygen mask that had slipped from his father's face. Save your strength, Dad, Daniel urged, but Elijah shook his head slightly. Need to say this. You two, together. That's what matters. Not medals. Not recognition. He took a labored breath. You did what I couldn't. You fought from the inside. His eyes closed again as he drifted back to unconsciousness, but his vital signs remained stable. The doctor, checking him later, seemed cautiously optimistic. He's a fighter, Dr. Reynolds observed. But don't get your hopes too high. The cancer is still advancing. The following week, Daniel's trial began. The courthouse was surrounded by protesters and supporters, the media presence unprecedented for the small town. Inside, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Sarah Nichols proved herself a formidable attorney, methodically dismantling the government's case against Daniel. When Ava Carter, who had finally emerged from hiding under Sarah's protection, took the stand, her testimony silenced the room. I watched Elijah Harper save 27 civilians that day, she stated, her voice unwavering. When he received the order to eliminate all witnesses, he looked the commander in the eye and said, "Then you'll have to shoot me first." And one by one, every member of our unit stood with him. The prosecution struggled to discredit her, but Ava had come prepared, with documents, with photographs, with the personal effects of victims that she had secretly preserved for 3 decades. On the 3rd day of the trial, David took the stand, in full dress uniform, the last time he would wear it, he knew. Captain Harper, Sarah began, can you tell the court about the documents you discovered in the Pentagon archives? David leaned into the microphone. I found internal memos confirming, that Project Ember was deliberately covered up. That Armitage Solutions pressured the Department of Defense to create a false narrative, that my father and his unit were threatened with court-martial if they spoke out. And how did you obtain these documents? The prosecutor demanded during cross-examination. Through my security clearance as a Pentagon liaison, David answered calmly. A clearance you no longer possess because you violated your oath? David met his gaze steadily. I violated no oath. I swore to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Covering up war crimes violates that Constitution. The courtroom erupted in applause, forcing the judge to call for order. By the final day, the mood had shifted dramatically. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning their verdict, not guilty on all charges. The verdict was read. Daniel gripped David's hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. Sarah let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for days. In the gallery, Jalen whooped with joy before being shushed by a court officer. The judge, a Vietnam veteran himself, added an extraordinary statement after dismissing the jury. This court recommends that the Department of Defense launch a full investigation into Project Ember and the subsequent cover-up. Furthermore, we recommend that Elijah Harper be recognized for his moral courage and service to the true ideals of this nation. Outside, the crowd erupted when Daniel and David emerged. Veterans surged forward, forming an impromptu honor guard as the brothers made their way to their car. "What now?" Daniel asked as they drove back to the hospital. David's face was thoughtful. "Now we make sure Dad knows that it was all worth it." But as they pulled into the hospital parking lot, their phones rang simultaneously. It was Dr. Reynolds. "You need to come quickly," he said. "Your father doesn't have much time left." They ran through the hospital corridors, all decorum forgotten in their urgency. When they reached Elijah's room, they found him conscious, but barely so, his breathing shallow and labored. "Dad," David said, taking one of his hands while Daniel took the other. "We won. The jury found Daniel not guilty. The judge recommended you be honored for what you did." A faint smile crossed Elijah's lips. "Good," he whispered. "That's good." "There's more," Daniel added. "The Secretary of Defense just announced a full review of Project Ember, and Senator Tate has resigned amid the scandal." Elijah's eyes, though clouded with pain, showed a spark of satisfaction. He squeezed their hands weakly. "Dad, the judge recommended you for the Medal of Honor," David continued, his voice breaking. "After all these years, they're going to recognize what you did." Elijah's gaze shifted between his sons, love and pride evident despite his failing strength. "Already got my reward," he managed. "You boys, together again." As night fell, veterans outside the hospital held a candlelight vigil. They stood in silent formation, a living memorial to a man most had never met, but whose story had touched something fundamental in them. Inside, David and Daniel maintained their vigil of a different kind, each holding one of their father's hands, as his breathing grew more labored, as the monitors showed his heart struggling to continue its faithful duty. "We're right here, Dad," Daniel whispered. "We're not going anywhere." "We've got your six," David added, using the military phrase for watching someone's back. Outside the door, Jalen waited, his young face streaked with tears but determined to be strong, just as Elijah had taught him. In Washington, the Pentagon press secretary issued an unprecedented statement. "In light of recent evidence, the Department of Defense will recommend that Elijah Harper be posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for acts of valor above and beyond the call of duty." The press office phones immediately lit up with a single question. Posthumously. "Has Elijah Harper died?" "No," came the carefully worded response. "But we understand his condition is grave, and we wanted to ensure the recognition would be granted, regardless of outcome." What the statement didn't say, couldn't say, was that after decades of silence, the institution was finally trying to do right by a man who had always done right by others, even when it cost him everything. In Millfield General, the twins continued their watch, united in purpose as they hadn't been in years, silently promising their father that his legacy of honor, of truth, of moral courage would live on through them. Dawn broke over Millfield with gentle rays that filtered through the hospital room window. David sat in the chair beside his father's bed, head bowed in exhaustion, while Daniel stood at the window watching the morning light touch the gathering of veterans who had maintained their vigil through the night. The steady beep of monitors had become a soundtrack to their lives over the past week. Dr. Reynolds entered, checking Elijah's vitals with practiced movements. "His body is shutting down," he said quietly. It could be hours or days, but you should prepare yourselves. The twins nodded, having already accepted the inevitable. Their focus now was ensuring their father's final days were filled with the dignity and recognition he deserved. Jalen appeared. In the doorway, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept. "Any change?" he asked. Daniel shook his head. "You should go home, get some rest." "I promised Mr. Harper I'd finish the eagle carving," Jalen replied, holding up a small wooden figure. "Almost done." David smiled tiredly. He'd like that. Mid-morning. Brought unexpected visitors, 3 senior military officials in formal dress uniforms. They requested a private moment with the brothers. "Your father's case has reached the highest levels," the lead officer explained in the hallway. "The president has personally reviewed the evidence and authorized an expedited Medal of Honor process." Daniel's eyes widened. "That usually takes years." "These are extraordinary circumstances," the officer replied. "The president also authorized full military honors for your father when—" He hesitated. "When the time comes." David straightened to attention. "Thank you, sir. He deserves nothing less." Later that afternoon, Elijah's breathing changed, becoming more labored. The monitor showed his heartbeat weakening. David and Daniel moved closer to the bed, one on each side, while Jalen stood at the foot, clutching the finished wooden eagle. Elijah's eyes fluttered open, focusing first on one son, then the other. "My boys," he whispered. "We're here, Dad," Daniel said, gripping his hand. Elijah's gaze shifted to Jalen. "You finished it," the boy nodded, tears streaming down his face as he placed the eagle carving in Elijah's free hand. "Just like you taught me." A ghost of a smile touched Elijah's lips. "Good boy. You'll make a fine soldier someday." "The best," Jalen promised. Elijah's eyes moved back to his sons. "You boys made me proud," he whispered, his voice growing fainter. "And free." His eyes closed, his breathing slowed, and with one final gentle exhale, Elijah Harper left the battle he'd fought for so long. The monitors flatlined, their alarm a muted backdrop to the profound silence that filled the room. David reached across the bed to grasp Daniel's arm. The twins connected in their grief as they had once been connected in everything. Jalen sobbed, quietly, his young shoulders shaking. Outside, as if sensing the moment, the veterans stood and raised their hands in silent salute. The arrangements for Elijah's funeral moved with unprecedented speed. The White House had issued directives that cut through the usual red tape, ensuring that the ceremony would reflect the honor being bestowed. "They're afraid of the optics," Daniel observed cynically as they met with the funeral director. "Better to embrace the story than fight it." "Does it matter why?" David asked. "Dad's getting the recognition he deserves." 3 days after Elijah's passing, Jalen approached the brothers with a request. "I'd like to speak at the funeral," he said, his young face serious. "I wrote something." The twins exchanged glances, then David nodded. "He'd like that. You were important to him." Meanwhile, the story of Elijah Harper had spread far beyond Millfield. News outlets covered every development, from the legal vindication to the president's intervention. Veterans organizations across the country held memorial services, and military academies incorporated the case into their ethics curriculum overnight. The morning before the funeral, David and Daniel made a final stop at Johnson's pawn shop. The old shopkeeper recognized them. "Immediately. Been expecting you boys," he said, reaching beneath the counter. "Kept this one back when some folks started coming in asking about your dad's medals." He placed a small box on the counter. "The Silver Star. Seemed right that you should have." Daniel opened the box with reverent hands, staring at the medal that had been the highest recognition of their father's valor. Until now. "How much?" David asked. Johnson shook his head. "No charge. Your dad was a good man. Used to stop by sometimes just to check on his medals. Said he was saving up to buy them back someday." The revelation hit the brothers hard. Even in his final years, their father had hoped to reclaim the symbols of his service, not for vanity, but perhaps to someday tell them the truth. "Thank you," Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. That afternoon, Millfield transformed as the funeral procession prepared to move through town. American flags lined the streets. People stood shoulder to shoulder on the sidewalks, many holding handmade signs honoring Elijah. The high school band assembled, ready to play as the casket passed. At the funeral home, David and Daniel stood in their dress uniforms, greeting the seemingly endless line of mourners. Military personnel from every branch attended, including generals and admirals who had never met Elijah but understood the significance of his story. "He would have hated all this attention," Daniel murmured to his brother. David smiled faintly. "Absolutely. But he deserves every bit of it." The procession to the cemetery was led by a military honor guard, followed by the flag-draped casket on a horse-drawn caisson. Behind walked David and Daniel, then Jalen, and finally hundreds of veterans, active duty personnel and civilians. The cemetery itself was filled beyond capacity. A special platform had been erected for the ceremony, with the Medal of Honor, displayed prominently beside a portrait of a young Elijah in uniform. The chaplain spoke first, followed by a general who had reviewed the Project Ember files and spoken forcefully in favor of clearing Elijah's name. Then Jalen approached the microphone, a piece of paper trembling in his hands. "Mr. Harper didn't just teach me how to carve wood," he began, his young voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "He carved out truth from lies. He shaped honor from obligation. He showed me that doing the right thing isn't about following orders. It's about following your conscience even when it costs you everything." His simple words, delivered with the unvarnished emotion of youth, moved the crowd visibly. Many veterans wept openly. "He told me once that real heroes don't come home," Jalen continued. "But he was wrong. Some heroes come home and keep fighting battles we can't see. Mr. Harper fought cancer. He fought poverty. He fought the memory of what he'd been forced to do and what he'd chosen not to do. And through it all, he taught me, a kid with no dad of my own, how to be a man of principle." As Jalen finished, Daniel squeezed his shoulder in silent gratitude. The formal military ceremony proceeded with precision, the rifle salute cracking through the air, the mournful notes of taps echoing across the cemetery, the meticulous folding of the flag that had draped Elijah's casket. A high-ranking officer presented the folded flag to David, who accepted it with a crisp salute. Then came the moment they had been waiting for. The Secretary of the Army approached the microphone. "Today we posthumously award the Medal of Honor to Master Sergeant Elijah Harper for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." He read the citation, which detailed not only Elijah's actions during Project Ember, but his moral courage in facing the consequences of his choice to save innocent lives. David and Daniel stood at attention as the medal was presented, placed in David's hands with solemn ceremony. What happened next wasn't in the program. David stepped forward, removed his own Distinguished Service Cross, and placed it on his father's casket. Daniel followed, adding his Meritorious Service Medal beside his brother's. "These were earned because of what you taught us," David said, quietly. "They belong with you." The gesture, unplanned but deeply meaningful, rippled through the crowd. One by one, veterans approached, placing their own medals and ribbons on or near the casket, spontaneous offerings to a man who had sacrificed his honors for something greater. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, the brothers stood alone at the gravesite. The casket was adorned with dozens of medals now, gleaming in the late afternoon sun. "What do we do with them all?" Daniel wondered. "I have an idea," David replied. 1 week later, a small bronze bust of Elijah Harper was unveiled at the Pentagon, placed in a corridor where military personnel passed daily. On the plaque beneath it were the words, "Truth above all." But the most powerful tribute came from the twins themselves. They established the Elijah Harper Honor Grant, a full scholarship to West Point for students who demonstrated exceptional moral character alongside academic and physical abilities. The first recipient was announced shortly thereafter. Jalen Williams, now 18, who had written his application essay about the man who had taught him the true meaning of service. As spring turned to summer, David and Daniel stood on the porch of their father's house, their house now, watching Jalen pack his car for the journey to West Point. "Dad would be proud," Daniel said, leaning against the railing. David nodded. Of all of us, the wooden eagle Jalen had carved sat on the porch railing, its wings spread wide, its gaze fixed on the horizon, a silent reminder of the man who had taught them all to soar higher than they thought possible. 20 years passed like the turning of seasons, sometimes slow, sometimes breathtakingly swift. Major Jalen Williams stood before a new class of recruits at Fort Benning, his uniform crisp, his bearing straight as the wooden eagle he still kept on his desk. "Before we begin your training," he said to the fresh-faced men and women, "I want you to watch something." The lights dimmed, and a short documentary began playing on the screen behind him. It opened with black and white photos of Elijah Harper, then footage of the twins at his funeral, the Medal of Honor ceremony, the veterans placing their medals on his casket. "This is the story of Elijah Harper," a narrator's voice explained. "A soldier who chose conscience over orders, truth over advancement, and family over recognition." The recruits watched in silence as the story unfolded. Project Ember, the cover-up, the pawned medals, the sons who uncovered the truth. When the lights came back up, many were visibly moved. "Every one of you will face moments where orders and conscience collide," Jalen told them. "I can't tell you what to choose, but I can tell you that your choices will echo through generations, just as Elijah Harper's did." Across the country, in a sunlit office at the Harper Military Ethics Institute, David Harper looked up from his papers as his brother entered without knocking, still his habit after all these years. "You're going to be late for your own lecture," Daniel admonished, leaning against the doorframe. At 57, David's hair had silvered at the temples, giving him the distinguished look of a seasoned academic. After leaving the military, he had found his calling teaching ethics at service academies, eventually founding the institute that bore their family name. "Just finishing my notes," David replied, gathering his materials. "How's the foundation?" Daniel, who ran the Harper Whistleblower Defense Foundation, shrugged. "Busy. 3 new cases this month alone." The years had etched lines around his eyes, but he still moved with the energy that had characterized him since youth. Together, they walked across the campus where cadets saluted them respectfully, not just for their positions, but for the story everyone knew. "Have you seen this?" Daniel handed his brother a newspaper. The headline read, "Congress declares National Elijah Harper Day of Remembrance." David skimmed the article. "Dad would have hated this." "Completely," Daniel agreed with a grin. "Which is exactly why it's perfect." Their shared laughter echoed. Across the quad, 2 men who had found their way back to each other through loss and truth. That evening, they gathered with family and friends for their annual barbecue. It had started small, just the 2 of them remembering their father over beers on his birthday. Over the years, it had grown to include Jalen and his family, colleagues and fellow veterans who had been touched by Elijah's story. Jalen's children played in the yard of what had once been Elijah's modest home. The house itself had been preserved, much as it was, though the workshop out back had been expanded to accommodate more students for the woodcarving classes Daniel taught on weekends. "Uncle David! Uncle Daniel!" Jalen's youngest daughter called, running up with a wooden figure. "Look what I made!" It was a small, somewhat lopsided eagle, clearly carved by inexperienced hands but made with obvious care. "Perfect," David said, examining it seriously. "Your great-grandpa Elijah would approve." The child beamed, though Elijah had died long before she was born. Through stories and traditions, he remained alive for a new generation. As twilight settled over the gathering, Daniel found himself standing alone on the porch, looking at the space on the wall where his father's medals had once hung. Now, a single frame contained a photograph of Elijah in civilian clothes, surrounded by his sons and Jalen, taken during one of his last good days in the hospital. The actual medals, both Elijah's originals and the Medal of Honor, were displayed at the Elijah Harper House of Honor, the modest museum and veterans center that now operated in what had once been a rundown house on Oak Street. "Still miss him?" David asked, joining his brother on the porch. "Every day," Daniel admitted. "But I see him everywhere. In Jalen's kids, in the recruits who visit the museum, in the way you teach your students. They stood in comfortable silence, shoulder to shoulder as they had been in their youth. "Remember when we found that letter?" David asked suddenly. "The one in Dad's toolbox." Daniel nodded. Years after Elijah's death, they had discovered a hidden compartment in his old woodworking toolbox. Inside was a letter addressed to both of them, with the inscription, "For when you understand why I gave up everything." The letter itself had been simple, just a few lines in Elijah's steady hand. "My boys, if you're reading this, you've discovered the truth. Not just about Project Ember, but about the metals. I want you to know I never regretted it. Not for a single day. Some men are remembered for what they win. I hope to be remembered for what I gave away. The metals bought your future. You've repaid that debt 1,000 times by becoming the men you are. All my love, Dad." "We should add that letter to the exhibit at the museum," Daniel suggested. "People should know," David nodded. "I'll bring it tomorrow." Inside, Jalen called everyone to gather around the table laden with food. His wife, Sarah, the same Sarah Nichols who had defended Daniel at his trial, was directing their children to help serve. As they joined the others, conversation flowed easily between generations. Stories of Elijah were shared, many the youngsters had heard before but still clamored for. The legend had grown over the decades, but the core truth remained. One man's sacrifice had echoed through generations. Later, as the party wound down, David found himself alone with Jalen's oldest son, now a freshman at West Point. "Sir," the young man began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about specializing in military intelligence, like you and Uncle Daniel did." David studied the earnest, young face, so like Jalen's had been, and in some ways so like his and Daniel's at that age. "The most important intelligence isn't about the enemy," David told him. "It's about yourself, knowing what you stand for, what lines you won't cross. That's what your grandfather Elijah understood." "He wasn't my real grandfather," the young man pointed out. "Family isn't always blood," David replied. "Sometimes it's the people who teach you how to carve your own path." The following morning, David and Daniel met with the director of the Elijah Harper House of Honor to discuss a new exhibit. The small museum had become an unexpected tourist attraction for Millfield, drawing visitors from across the country who wanted to learn about the soldier who had chosen conscience over career. "We've had requests to loan some of the artifacts to the Smithsonian," the director informed them. "They're doing an exhibit on moral courage in military history. Elijah would be featured prominently," the brothers agreed readily. Their father's story deserved the widest audience possible, not for his sake, but for those who might face similar choices. As they walked through the museum, they paused before the central display. In a specially designed case sat Elijah's original, medals recovered from various sources over the years, arranged in a triangle with the Medal of Honor at the apex. Beside them were the medals his sons had placed on his casket, and photos of the spontaneous tribute that had followed. 20 years, Daniel murmured. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like a story that happened to someone else," David replied. "Until I see these." He gestured to a faded photograph showing Elijah with his twin sons as teenagers, his strong hands on their shoulders, his face alight with pride. On their way out, they passed a group of schoolchildren, being led through the exhibits. The tour guide, a local veteran, was explaining Project Ember in terms the children could understand. Elijah Harper had to choose between following orders and saving innocent people, the guide was saying. He knew he might lose everything, but he chose to do what was right anyway. A small girl raised her hand. Was he scared? The guide smiled. I think he probably was. Brave people still feel fear. They just don't let it stop them. Outside, the sign in front of the museum caught the morning light. The Elijah Harper House of Honor, where courage meets conscience. David and Daniel stood for a moment, looking back at what had once been just another small-town storefront. Dad used to say medals mean something only if they're earned, Daniel recalled. And legacies mean something only if they're lived, David finished. As if, on cue, Jalen pulled up in his car waving to them. They had a meeting at the foundation, then lectures to give, causes to champion, wrongs to right, the work of living their father's legacy. In the distance, the town of Millfield went about its day, forever changed by the quiet sacrifices of a man who had pawned his metals to give his sons a future, never imagining that one day those sons would return the honor 100-fold. "Ready?" Jalen called. The twins nodded and stepped forward together, as they had been taught to do all those years ago by a father who understood that the truest valor isn't what you claim, but what you give away. What price would you pay for those you love, and would they ever know the true depth of your sacrifice? Elijah Harper's story reminds us that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happen not on battlefields, but in quiet moments of choice. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share to hear more tales of courage that change lives forever.